Alright, so here it is, the water-cooled Cooler Master NR200P, and I wanted to do something a little bit different for this one, apart from my usual ITX water-cooled builds. Instead of focusing on outright performance and trying to cram as much radiator volume as I could into this case, I wanted to focus a bit more on aesthetics and the overall look of the build. And overall, I think it looks quite good, really happy with how it turned out, and I think at least on the scale of water-cooled builds, this one was quite easy to do. No real special parts required, which was really great, and that means that it's also quite easy for you guys to replicate if you guys are interested in doing that. Most of the specific parts that went into here aren't too important, especially with new high-end GPUs just around the corner, but for what it's worth, this build is using a Ryzen 3950X and a GTX 1080 Ti. But let's talk about the parts that are important for this build, and that's the water cooling hardware. So there are two options that you can choose when water cooling in this case. You could try and maximize the cooling performance by using a side-mounted 280mm radiator paired with a bottom 240, and do something very similar to our recent build in the Ncase M1, which used two 240s. The performance that you would get from that setup would honestly handle any modern CPU and GPU that you could fit into that case. For those that remember, our dual 240mm loop in the Ncase was able to cool a stock RTX 2080 Ti to just 50 degrees C at a relatively quiet fan speed. Or you could build something like this, which won't have as much cooling performance, but looks a lot more interesting on your desk. I've stuck with soft tubing here, as I do for pretty much all of my ITX custom loops, but hardline tubing can definitely be done in this case, and that's something I might try in the future with those new GPUs around the corner. Now, something really convenient about the NR200 when it comes to water cooling is the pump mounting, where you can either mount your pump to the power supply cover or behind the front panel. You've got a lot more flexibility and clearance if you're mounting it towards the front like I have here. That way you can use a fairly large reservoir as well. Mounting is super simple, no need to drill holes or anything like that, just 4 easy screws. I did also consider mounting the power supply towards the front of the case and then mounting the pump res combo on that, but it just didn't look as good in my opinion, and it also blocks the motherboard section from view. Just know that that is another option for pump mounting. The specific pump res combo that I'm using here is the EK Quantum Kinetic VTX 160mm, and this is the longest reservoir that you'll be able to use in this position before you need to start worrying about different GPU fittings. As you can see, the clearance is pretty close. Overall, I can definitely recommend this specific pump res combo. I think it works really well in this case, and they do also make a shorter model as well. So if you don't want that big reservoir filling up the middle of your build, then the shorter option is there as well. In terms of the new VTX pump from EK, overall my experience with it has been quite positive. It filled the loop up quite easily, and it stays pretty much silent at anything under 2500 RPM. For those that are interested in doing something similar to this but with a vertical GPU instead of a standard one like I have here, you'll need to be a lot more creative with the pump and res mounting. As you can see, even with a reference length water block, there's not much room left in front of it for the pump, only 67mm of clearance between the block and the panel. Underneath the GPU water block, you've got 57mm of clearance until the bottom panel, so a regular slim radiator plus normal thickness fans gets pretty close to maxing that out. Here I'm using an EK Classic 240mm SE radiator that's 27mm thick, paired with some Nidec Gentle Typhoon fans, which amounts to 52mm of thickness. So that's pulling air up into the case, and then the hot air is actively exhausted by two 120mm fans at the top. This is also the first build that I've done with EK's torque fittings, and I'll just say that I've already ordered a bunch more of these for future builds. Personally, I'm a big fan of how rigid they are, with pretty much zero wobble from side to side, and they do look super clean. I did find them a bit more difficult to work with though at the beginning, since the thread travel is actually fairly short on these fittings, so it can be a bit hard to properly close them. One tip I can give before trying to close the fitting is just to wet the end of the tubing before sliding the fitting over. That makes it a whole lot easier. For those that want to know exactly what fittings I've used and where I've put them, there are two 90-degree fittings on the GPU. There's a 90-degree and a standard compression fitting on the CPU block. On the pump, there's two more 90-degree fittings. On the radiator, there are two 90-degree fittings jointed here, which kind of allows me to easily kind of feed it into the GPU water block. And then on the other side of the radiator that feeds up into the pump, there is a 45-degree and just a straight fitting. Now with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at what kind of thermal performance you can expect from this build. And I just want to reiterate that this is not a performance-focused build. We're not trying to cram as much cooling capacity in this case like I have done with many other ITX water-cooled builds. Here, we're kind of just aiming to get good enough thermal performance for a quiet gaming system, for example, and still have something that looks really appealing on your desk. So for what it's worth, the GTX 1080 Ti is a 260 watt TDP card, so you can expect the thermals here for the RTX 2080 Super or 2080 Ti to be fairly similar. Keep in mind that this is also with a fairly conservative fan speed as well, 1200 RPM for the radiator fans, 900 RPM for the top exhaust fans, and a quiet 2500 RPM for the VTX pump. Thermals for the 3950X were a bit on the warmer end though, but still totally fine, topping out at just under 80 degrees C after a 25-minute blender render. So although these thermals are fine, it's less than ideal for a water-cooled system, and if you were to build a system based around 3D rendering, then I would definitely recommend some more radiator volume. So, would I recommend building this? Well, it's a fairly easy build. You have a lot of flexibility with which parts you use, and the tube routing is fairly straightforward. Keep in mind though that for a 240mm custom loop, thermals are just okay. There's minimal clearance between the radiator fans and the graphics card, which means that airflow is less than ideal. Overclocking is definitely out of the question here, but otherwise I think the setup will handle most configurations perfectly fine. So if you're interested in doing this, then I will leave all of the parts that you'll need down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.